The first thing anyone noticed were the boots. They were planted heel-deep in the permafrost of Callisto's northern shelf, toes pointing at the gas giant overhead, exactly as they had stood for 67 years. The boots were not human. They were jointed in the wrong places and far too long, and where a human ankle would have bent forward, there was instead a secondary joint that bent back, like a bird's. Around the boots the ice was different, glassy and faintly amber-colored, dense in a way that standard permafrost was not. Sergeant Leah Marchetti crouched and put her palm flat on the surface and felt nothing, no vibration, no thermal signature. "Survey drone got this on the second pass," said Lieutenant Osi from behind her, holding a tablet so she could see the composite image. "We thought it was debris from the Vandermeer wreck. It's not." She stood and looked out across the crater field where the drilling team had been setting charges. There were shards of the Vandermeer's hull everywhere. The colony ship had come down on this shelf in 2134, and no one had ever recovered most of it. But the amber ice and its occupant were something else entirely. The amber ice was a rough ellipse, perhaps 4 meters long and a meter wide, like a capsule that had been poured around whoever was inside. "Get Commander Voss," she said. Commander Hendrik Voss arrived 14 minutes later, in an exosuit with his helmet off because he never wore his helmet when the external temperature was above -60, which it technically was, and which drove Marchetti to a quiet fury every single time. He walked around the amber ellipse twice. He got down on one knee and peered through the ice. He stood up and put his hands on his hips, in a posture she recognized as the one he used when he was about to say something he was already pleased with himself for thinking. "Ship registry check, comes back clean," he said. "Nothing Concordiate, nothing Rim Colonial, nothing in the archive matches that boot design." He tilted his head, "Which means it's either very old human, pre-Concordiate, pre-colony, maybe even pre-space flight." He paused for effect. "Or it isn't human." "It isn't human," said Osi flatly. He'd been in xenobiology before his commission. The ice was shipped to the Iden station with a research team, an escort of 4 Concordiate defense soldiers, and Commander Voss, who came along on the basis that he was the one who'd found it, and he was therefore not prepared to miss whatever happened next. What happened next took 11 days and generated more heated communications between Iden Station and the Concordiate Administrative Council on Earth than the station's director, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, had received in her entire prior career combined. Tanaka was 61 and had run research installations since she was 38, and she had seen a great many things. But she had not seen anything like the being that emerged, blinking, from the amber ice on the morning of the 12th day. He was tall, that was the first thing. The proportions were wrong in a way that the brain kept trying to correct and failing. The torso too long, the neck articulated in sections, the face assembled from the right components, but arranged in a slightly different geometry, as though someone had described a humanoid face from memory, and the memory had been imperfect. His eyes were the yellow-green of old glass. His skin was the gray-white of birch bark. When he first opened those eyes and the light of the station hit him, he made a sound that the station's acoustic sensors logged as a vocalization in the 4,200 Hz range, lower than most human speech, textured like distant thunder, and immediately recognizable to anyone who heard it as something deeply uncertain. Tanaka was the first person he looked at. She did not step back. She said in the calmest voice she had, "You're safe. You're in a medical bay. Can you understand me?" He could not. Of course he could not. He lay in the medical cradle and looked at the ceiling and moved his long fingers very slowly, testing them, and breathed in a way that sounded deliberate, like a person reminding themselves how. They named him, provisionally, Paul. It was Marchetti's suggestion, and no one had a better one. What followed was a month of furious, exhilarating, exhausting xenolinguistics work, during which Osi, Tanaka, and a rotating team of specialists established a rough pidgin with Paul sufficient to communicate basic concepts. He had a language. It was structured around sound gradients rather than discrete phonemes, and it relied on harmonic layering that required the station's processors to parse it in real time. But it was absolutely a language with grammar and subordinate clauses, and what appeared to be a sardonic conditional tense that was used for situations the speaker found absurd. He used it often. What they understood, assembled over weeks from fragments and inference. Paul was a member of a species they had no name for, which he indicated with a hand pressed flat to his own chest. He had been a soldier. His vessel, not the Vandermeer, something older, something that had come to Callisto's orbit long before the Vandermeer was built, had failed catastrophically. The amber substance was his species' emergency preservation medium, a biological process he had initiated manually when he understood the ship was lost. He had expected to be recovered by his own kind. He had not expected to wake up here. The Concordia Administrative Council held 17 emergency sessions in as many days. Some of them were about Paul. Most of them were about what Paul represented, because Paul was not alone. The linguistic and cultural mapping Tanaka's team was doing suggested a civilization, organized, spacefaring, significantly older than humanity's own ventures beyond Sol. A civilization that had apparently sent at least one vessel to Callisto 67 years ago. A civilization that might reasonably wonder what had happened to that vessel. "We don't know if they're coming back," said the Council's Chief of External Relations on a very long secure call with Idun Station, speaking in the measured tones of a man who wanted to convey calm and was not calm. "We don't know their disposition. We don't know how they'll respond to the situation." "We know, Paul," said Tanaka. "We know one of them." "We know one of them," she agreed. "That's a start." What the Council decided, and what they told Tanaka to implement, and what Tanaka relayed to Voss, who relayed it to Marchetti, who stood in the corridor outside the briefing room and stared at the ceiling for a long time afterward, was this. Paul was not to know that 67 years had passed. He was not to know what humanity had built. The medical consensus was that the metabolic and cognitive shock of discovering the true temporal displacement could damage him, possibly fatally. More practically, the political consensus was that they needed time. Time to understand his people. Time to prepare. Time to figure out what they were dealing with before they handed an alien soldier a full accounting of human capabilities and expansion. So they would tell him it had been a short time, a navigational error, a recovery, an unfamiliar medical facility. They would maintain the fiction for as long as they could. They would learn everything they could in the meantime. Commander Voss's response to this plan was a short silence followed by, "Right. No problem." Marchetti spent that night lying on her bunk doing arithmetic she didn't like. She was the one who drew the short straw for daily direct contact shifts, which meant she was the one who sat with Paul in the Xenomod Bay and worked through the pigeon with him for 3 hours every morning. She had not expected to like him. She had not expected him to have what she could only describe, reluctantly, as a sense of humor. The sardonic conditional tense got quite a workout in their sessions, especially when the food dispensary offered him something he found texturally unacceptable, which was most things. He had a habit of examining human equipment with an expression that conveyed polite incomprehension, as though he was too diplomatic to ask why they'd built it that way. He had a gesture he made when he was thinking hard. One long hand pressed flat to the side of his throat, over what she assumed was an organ analogous to a larynx, that she'd started unconsciously doing herself in meetings, which Osi had noticed and chosen not to mention. He asked about the lights. She explained electricity. He used the sardonic conditional for that, briefly, then appeared to reconsider. He asked about the sound the ventilation system made. She explained Hudvac. He made a sound she'd learned to recognize as the equivalent of a skeptical exhale. He asked, very carefully, how long he had been in the ice. She told him, following the approved script, that there had been some disruption to their standard timekeeping systems, and they were still running calibrations. He looked at her for a long moment with those yellow-green eyes, and she held the look and did not flinch. And finally he pressed his hand to his throat in the thinking gesture and seemed to accept it. She walked out of the session, went directly to the smallest supply closet she could find, and stood in it in the dark for approximately 4 minutes. The problem was not that the deception was wrong. She'd told herself enough times that it was medically justified, politically necessary, that Paul's own well-being was served by it. The problem was that Paul was not what she'd expected. He was not an abstraction or a diplomatic object or a specimen. He was a person who had gone to sleep expecting to be found by his own kind, and had woken up, surrounded by strangers in an unfamiliar place, and was handling it with a dignity she found quietly devastating. The second problem was Commander Voss. Voss had taken a strong interest in Paul's rank insignia. Paul wore a garment. It had survived the amber preservation in remarkable condition, that included a series of graduated markings along one shoulder assembly that the team believed indicated military rank. They were striking. Deep, iridescent notches cut into what appeared to be a semi-biological material, catching the light at different angles. Voss had developed the theory, or at least the persistent hope, that the number of notches correlated to seniority in a command structure. and that if he could accurately determine Paul's rank, he could establish a precedent for diplomatic equality of standing. This theory required him to look at Paul's shoulder very frequently. Paul had noticed. Paul's equivalent of a raised eyebrow, which involved a subtle realignment of the brow plates that Marchetti had learned to read, appeared every time Voss came into the room and made an excuse to stand at Paul's left side. "He keeps looking at my rank plate," Paul communicated in the pigeon to Marchetti one morning. "He finds your insignia interesting," she said carefully. The sardonic conditional was deployed with some force. "He wants to take it. He doesn't want to take it. He wants to wear one like it." Marchetti looked at the middle distance for a moment. He is a military officer. Military officers tend to think about rank. Paul made the sound she'd learned was a low laugh. It was odd to hear, too deep, too textured, but it was unmistakably laughter. "I understand this," he communicated. "My third-in-command spent his entire service trying to acquire the rank plate of our ship's navigator. I never understood why. The navigator was not even particularly senior." She filed this away in the growing log she kept, separate from the official records, of things Paul had told her that felt important not for military intelligence purposes but for simple personhood reasons. The deception began to buckle in its fifth week. It buckled not through any dramatic revelation, but through the compound pressure of a very smart person in an unusual situation paying very close attention. Paul began asking questions whose answers, if given honestly, would be inconsistent with the cover timeline. He asked about the construction materials of the station, specifically why certain alloys appeared in configurations that implied fabrication processes beyond what he understood human metallurgy to be capable of. He asked about the communication arrays, which were too sophisticated. He asked about the food, which contained protein structures that implied agricultural systems of significant scale and complexity. Each question was asked simply, without apparent suspicion, but the questions were accumulating. And then there was the day he found the window. Idun station orbited Callisto and the orbit carried it 4 times in every standard day through a position where Jupiter filled the observation port in the main corridor outside the Xenomed Bay. Jupiter at full disk, banded and vast and impossible to mistake, its great red spot clearly visible, its inner moons as bright points in the near foreground. Paul stopped in front of that window on a routine transfer between the Xenomed Bay and the exercise facility, and he stood very still, and he looked at Jupiter for a long time. Then he looked at the moons. Marchetti was 3 steps behind him. She watched him count. She watched his lips move, not in their pigeon, in his own language, sub-vocalized, below the range of the acoustic sensors. She watched him count the moons and then count them again and then stand very still. He turned to look at her. She met his eyes. He said in their pigeon, "The orbital positions?" "Yes," she said. "They are not consistent with what I observed when my vessel entered this system." She said nothing. "The discrepancy," he said slowly, "is not small." She still said nothing. Her training said to redirect. Her mouth was not cooperating with her training. "Sergeant Marchetti," he said, and he said her name in a careful way, in a way that carried its weight. "How long was I in the ice?" The official answer was ready. She had rehearsed it. She opened her mouth and the rehearsed answer did not come out. What came out was, "I'm going to get Commander Voss." What Voss did, when they were all 3 in the briefing room and Tanaka was on the comm and the council's representative was on a secondary channel that kept breaking up, was deliver a performance she would think about for years. He sat across from Paul and he was visibly, painfully, frantically considering his options, and then he made his choice. And the choice he made was to tell Paul everything. Not calmly. Not with diplomatic preamble. He told it the way Marchetti imagined a man might tell a terrible joke he'd kept to himself too long. All at once, with slightly too much energy, leaning forward across the table, his hands moving in large gestures that seemed to surprise even him. 67 years, the Vandermeer colony ship. Humanity's expansion into the outer solar system, the Concordiat, 12 settled stations, a research base on Titan, propulsion advances, the agricultural networks that fed 40 million people off-world, the alloys, the arrays, all of it. He told Paul all of it, tumbling over himself, growing louder at points, and then catching himself and lowering his voice, and then getting loud again. When he finished, he sat back in his chair, breathing hard, and looked at Paul. And on his face was an expression that Marchetti could only describe as someone who had just done something irreversible and was waiting to learn whether it was a catastrophe. Paul sat very still. His hand was at his throat in the thinking gesture. His yellow-green eyes moved over the briefing room, its fixtures, its display surfaces, the communication arrays above the table. He was recontextualizing everything he could see, Marchetti realized. Everything was different now. Everything the room contained was different now that he understood how long it had taken humanity to build it. The silence lasted long enough that Tanaka's voice came through the comm. "Paul, do you need?" "No," he said. Not in the pidgin. In his own language, one word, clear enough in any language. Then in the pidgin, 67 years. "Yes," said Voss. "And you were afraid to tell me." Voss looked at the table. The medical assessment was, "You were afraid of what I represented," Paul said. "A soldier, a scout possibly, advanced contact for my kind." A pause. "You were afraid that if I knew what you had built, I would tell you things that frightened you. And you were afraid that if I did not know what you had built, I would not fully understand what you had built." The sardonic conditional was not present. His voice was level, unhurried. "You were afraid in two directions at once. This is uncomfortable." "Yes," said Voss. "It is also," Paul said, "very human." He pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them. His long, unfamiliar hands, not human, wrong in their proportions, perfectly still now. He looked at them for a moment, and then he looked up. "I want to see the Titan base," he said. What followed was a diplomatic crisis that occupied the Concordiat Council for 6 months and generated an institutional response, roughly equivalent to someone handing a live wire to 14 people simultaneously and asking them to please take turns. The first contact protocols that existed were theoretical frameworks designed for scenarios that involved approaching another civilization's existing infrastructure. They did not account for the situation in which the other civilization's representative was sitting in your medical bay, asking to visit your research outpost, and expressing what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm about your propulsion systems. Paul was, it turned out, not a scout. This took some weeks to establish through the pidgin, which had expanded considerably, and now encompassed enough nuance that complex concepts could be exchanged, imperfectly but sufficiently. He had been in the vessel that was lost, something closer to what humanity would call an engineer at arms, a technical specialist who also carried weapons and knew how to use them. His mission to the outer solar system had been reconnaissance a kind, but not military. More like a naturalist expedition with defensive capability. His people, and here the language became difficult, full of harmonic layers the processors struggled with. His people were, at the time of his preservation, in a period of significant internal argument about what to do with the evidence of another spacefaring species discovered in a solar system they had been observing. Some of them had wanted to approach. Others had wanted to wait. Others, a significant faction, had argued that the best course was to never make contact at all, to allow the younger species to develop without interference, to observe only. The argument had not been resolved before Paul's vessel was lost. 67 years had passed on Callisto. Considerably less time subjectively had passed in the debate. "Your people may still be watching," Marchetti said, on a gray afternoon, in the now expanded Xenome Bay, which had been decorated with some prints from Earth at Paul's request. He had looked through an image database for hours and selected, apparently entirely at random, 3 geological survey photographs of mountain ranges that he found structurally interesting. "Yes," he said. "Does that change anything? For you?" He considered this with the hand at his throat. The gesture was familiar enough now that she almost didn't see it anymore. "I woke up," he said finally, "in a place I did not expect. The people who found me were not my people. They were frightened of me and did not want me to know how much they had built while I slept. They fed me things that tasted wrong and kept trying to look at my rank plate." The low-textured sound of the laugh again. And yet," she agreed. "And yet here I am, asking to see Titan." He looked at the mountain range photograph on the wall for a moment. "I have been thinking about the argument my people were having. The 3 positions: to approach, to wait, to never approach at all." He was quiet a moment. "I now have a 4th position to contribute." "What's that?" "That it is already too late for any of the 3, he said. "That once you found me in the ice, the question of whether to make contact had already been answered by accident, and that this is perhaps the best way for it to happen. No decision, no policy. Just 2 shoes in the crater and someone crouching down to look." She thought about the first moment, the boots in the amber ice, the way she'd put her palm on the surface, the way Osisi had said it isn't human with that flat certainty. "That's a long speech for someone who usually lets me do the talking," she said. The brow plates shifted. The sardonic conditional played at the edge of his expression. "I am an engineer," he said. "We prepare for significant announcements. The Titan visit was approved. It took 4 months of negotiation, 3 Concordiate council sessions, 1 security review that Marchetti personally found insultingly thorough, given that Paul had spent 8 months in the station without causing any difficulty whatsoever, and a medical bill that needed convincing that the trip would not cause him physiological harm. In the end, it was approved primarily because Paul had simply asked for it, reasonably and repeatedly, and the council had eventually run out of reasons to say no that didn't embarrassingly boil down to "we're not ready for you to see it yet." They took a shuttle, Voss came, Tanaka came. Marchetti sat next to Paul for the 11-hour transit, and they played a tile game that OC had adapted from the station's recreation archive, adjusting the rules to accommodate Paul's hand-eye and his apparent preference for games with more strategic depth than human tile games traditionally offered, which he had communicated through the sardonic conditional when she'd first suggested checkers. Jupiter dwindled behind them. Saturn grew ahead. When Titan appeared, pale and amber in the viewports, she watched Paul look at it the way she imagined people looked at places they'd read about for a long time and never expected to actually see. "There are people living there," he said. "Not a question. 700, she said. Mostly researchers, some mineral survey teams." He watched it for a long time. She let him watch it. "My people," he said eventually, "are very old." He said it without pride, in the same flat way one states a material fact. "We have traveled for a very long time. We have seen species in earlier stages of development. We have seen what happens to them. We have watched some flourish and some not." A pause. "We have had the argument about contact approximately 9,000 times by my reckoning. It has never been resolved cleanly. Humans have the same argument," she said. "We call it the Fermi paradox." He turned to look at her. "You named it? We named it after the physicist who formalized it. The basic question: if life is common, why haven't we met anyone?" The uncomfortable answer, one of them, is that perhaps it's common to develop space travel and then stop, to choose not to be found. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then, or to be too careful for too long and find only a pair of boots in the ice, or that. He made the sound of the low laugh, and this time she heard in it something she hadn't heard before. Something tired, she thought, and old, and very slightly relieved. The Titan base was designed for humans. The corridors were human scale, the equipment human designed, the whole structure built around the assumption of human bodies and human needs. Paul walked through it with the careful attention of a person who is simultaneously too large for a space and too polite to say so. He examined the methane extraction systems with professional interest. He looked at the atmospheric processors for a long time without speaking. In the main laboratory, he stood in front of a holographic model of Saturn's ring system and tracked the individual particle simulations with one long finger, not quite touching the display, his lips moving in sub-vocalized calculation. One of the younger researchers, who had been briefed but not, evidently, briefed sufficiently, backed into a doorframe while staring at him and knocked over a monitor stand, which struck a secondary console, which triggered a cascade of alarm warnings through the whole lab that took 4 minutes and 6 humans to silence. Paul watched this entire sequence with the brow plates in a position Marchetti now read as politely entertained. When quiet was restored, he looked at her. "Your colleague," he said, "may want to recalibrate the impact threshold on the secondary console." "I'll pass that on," she said. The return transit was quiet. Paul slept for part of it. Not the amber ice preservation sleep, just ordinary sleep, which he'd taken to doing during long transits, and which still looked subtly wrong in the way all his biometrics looked subtly wrong when you compared them to a human baseline, but which Tanaka's team had confirmed was fine, was simply what his physiology did when it needed to rest. Voss sat in the co-pilot station working through administrative messages. Marchetti sat behind Paul's seat and watched the stars and thought about boots in the crater and 9,000 years of unresolved argument. They were 2 hours out from Idun Station when Paul woke and said quietly to the viewport, "I need to tell my people." Voss turned from the co-pilot station. "Not the council," Paul said. "My people, directly." He turned to look at Marchetti. "I want to send a signal. Using your arrays, calibrated to my ship's communication frequency, I want to tell them I am alive, and I want to tell them what I found." Voss opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Marchetti. She looked at Paul. "What will you tell them?" He thought about it. The hand at the throat, slow, deliberate. "That the argument is over," he said. "That the question resolved itself, accidentally, and the accident was not bad." He paused. "That the younger species put my boots in a crate and shipped me to their medical facility and fed me things that tasted wrong and were very frightened of what I represented. and that this is all exactly what my people would have done in the same situation. He looked at her steadily. That they named me Paul. She felt something shift in the way the shuttle's air moved, or maybe in herself. They gave you that name, she said. Yes, and I kept it. A beat. This is relevant, I think, to what I want to tell them. Voss, after a silence that was for him quite uncharacteristically thoughtful, said, "We'll need to brief the council." "Yes," said Paul. "You will need to do many things. This is also relevant." The council, briefed, spent 3 days in emergency session. In the end, they authorized the signal, on the grounds that Paul would send it regardless, and it was better to be involved in the process than to have him do it from a supply closet with improvised equipment, which Marchetti had gently suggested was a real possibility. The signal went out on a frequency that human arrays could generate but had never had reason to target. It was 40-second long. Paul composed it alone, in his own language, in the Xenomed Bay, with the mountain range photographs on the wall and a cup of something Tanaka's team had developed that approximated, in texture and temperature, the food he remembered from his vessel. He composed it once and did not revise it. They never learned exactly what it said. The real-time translation processors flagged approximately a third of the harmonic layers as beyond their current parsing capability. What they got were fragments, something about duration, something about unexpected. The sardonic conditional used several times in quick succession, something that the processors flagged, tentatively, as a locative construction meaning approximately here, in this place, with these people. And then at the end, a phrase the processors returned with unusual confidence. Not a translation, the harmonic structure was too specific for a clean translation, but an approximation. Something like what they built while I slept, and something like worth the trouble of sleeping, and possibly, the processors assigned this a confidence of only 43%. Something like I think you should come and see. The signal went. The arrays returned to their standard operations. Paul ate the approximate food, which he had never once said he liked but had never refused. He looked at the mountain range photographs. Outside, at the edge of the system, nothing moved that they could detect. No response came in the hours after the signal, or in the days, or in the weeks. The council issued 3 different policy statements about what the signal may or may not have meant, and how humanity should interpret the silence. Marchetti didn't think it was silence, exactly. She thought it was the pause before a very long conversation. Voss, meanwhile, had developed a new preoccupation. He had begun researching the history of first contact protocols, with the apparent aim of writing a new one, based on practical experience. He had asked Paul, in a roundabout way that didn't entirely conceal the question underneath it, whether his people used rank insignia on a similar graduated scale, and whether, hypothetically, an exchange of such insignia might be understood as a gesture of standing between commanders. Paul had looked at him for a very long moment. The brow plates had done a thing she'd never quite seen them do before, something that might have been fond exasperation. "Commander," he said, "if you want a rank plate, I will make you one." Voss blinked. Yes. I would like that very much." "In return," Paul said, "you will tell me everything about the propulsion system on the long-range survey craft I saw in the Titan docking bay. The engineers were very cagey." "That's classified," said Voss. "Rank plate," said Paul. "I'll see what I can do," said Voss. Marchetti left them to it. She walked down the corridor to the observation window and stood where Paul had stood when he counted the moons, and she looked out at Jupiter, which was exactly where it was supposed to be, and at Callisto, which was small and pale and pocked with old impacts, and at the shelf where the amber ice had been, which was just a shelf now, ordinary permafrost, the crater filled in by the drilling team months ago. 2 shoes in the ice, someone crouching to look. She pressed her hand flat to the cold of the viewport, just as she'd pressed it to the amber surface on that first day, and felt nothing, and felt everything, and stood there in the corridor of a station orbiting a moon of Jupiter that was home to human beings, who had managed, entirely by accident, and through the medium of a very frightened commander with a rank plate fixation, to initiate first contact with a civilization 9,000 years old. Somewhere out at the edge of the system, the argument that had never been resolved was being read, in fragments, in harmonics, in the sardonic conditional of a language humanity was only beginning to understand. And the answer, when it came, and it would come, she was sure of that now. Not because of policy or protocol or any deliberate human choice, but because Paul had kept the name, because the signal had gone, because some things resolve themselves whether you plan for them or not. The answer would find them exactly as they were. Frightened, curious, proud of what they'd built, and unable to stop looking. Humanity had never been any good at looking away. That, she thought, was probably the most important thing she could tell anyone who wanted to understand what had happened here. Not the technology, not the diplomatic record, not the Council's 17 emergency sessions or Voss's rank plate negotiation, which she intended to describe in detail in her personal log because it deserved to survive. Just that. They had found boots in the ice, and they had not looked away. They never looked away. That was the whole story, really. That was always the whole story.